Welcome back, it's Jeff here again with another video, this time looking at the welfare effects of an import quota. So as we saw in the previous video, quotas are a way of trying to limit the volume or the quantity of imported products allowed into a country. So quotas restrict market access to imported products. And the result is usually, as we saw in the previous diagram, an increase in the price that consumers pay because you're creating that artificial or relative scarcity. Now, high prices leads to a fall in consumer surplus and lower real incomes, and it can also bring down the amount of choice that consumers have in the market. Some of the loss of consumer surplus, as we'll see as we walk through the diagram, goes to domestic suppliers who can now expand their production at the new higher price. So they will see a rise in producer surplus and also a little extra revenue. But as we'll see, there is a deadweight loss of economic welfare. Quotas, by raising price, by limiting trade, if you like, restricting trade, can cause a loss of welfare. That's an important analysis point. And unlike an import tariff, a quota does not lead directly to extra tax revenues for the government. So here's our quota diagram from last time. We were putting a quota on wheat coming into a country. The trade price was P2 without any restrictions on trade. When you put a quota restriction in, the new supply curve is domestic supply plus the quota, and the new equilibrium there is point G, which drives the price up to P3 from P2. As a result, demand contracts from D to G. Consumers are paying higher prices, but domestic producers are better able to supply at that higher price. Their production goes up from point E to F, which if you draw down to the axis is an expansion of output from Q3 to Q5. The quantity Q5, Q4 is imported. In other words, the quota is filled up with what's allowed in. Okay, so what about consumer surplus, first of all? Well, before the quota, consumer surplus at price P2 was the area A, D, P2, a big level of consumer surplus because they were able to buy the product very cheaply from overseas. After the quota, consumer surplus falls to A, G, P3. There's less consumed and they're paying a higher price. So consumer surplus goes down. What about producer surplus? Well, before the quota, domestic producers were selling at P2 and they were producing Q3. So their producer surplus was area P2EC, that small triangle on the left there. With the higher price, the price goes up to P3, their production goes up to Q5. So post-quota, domestic surplus goes up to area P3F. C. So an increase of P3FE, P2 of producer surplus. Okay, there are winners and losers from a quota. However, the loss of consumer surplus is much bigger than the gain in producer surplus, and therefore the welfare loss is the area E, F, G, D. Take a screenshot if you want to get this into your revision notes. Keep in mind, as we always say, good clear diagrams and label, please. Don't shade areas, label areas for clarity to help the examiner. So quotas tend to cause a bigger fall in welfare because the government doesn't gain any indirect tax revenues as they might expect from a tariff. Indeed, many developing countries with fairly high tariffs on things like farm products, the revenues from tariffs are quite often quite a sizable or chunky share of their tax revenues. Strict import quotas also, of course, create enforcement and compliance costs. You've got to be able to monitor and measure what's coming in, and that can increase border delays, delays at customs posts and things as checking goes on, and that acts as a further trade restriction and might even drive up the cost of imports still further. So there we go, 2 videos on quotas, an important part of trade protectionism. This one's looked at welfare effects, and hopefully you found it useful. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. Really appreciate it, as always. For now, stay happy, stay positive, stay curious, and see you again sometime soon.